They were supposed to save the fleet, and instead they froze it in place. Steel giants waited on the water while damaged ships bled time, space, and momentum. What was meant to keep the fight alive became another silent threat drifting behind the lines. The promise was simple. Stay forward. Stay ready. Keep ships in the war. But when the moment arrived, that promise cracked without warning. Crews watched hope sit just out of reach, massive and useless, while the enemy did not wait. Orders stalled. Decisions hesitated. The ocean kept moving. Somewhere between confidence and catastrophe, something essential failed. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to change everything. There were whispers before this moment. Concerns brushed aside, doubts filed away. Nothing proven, nothing stopped. Only faith that size and ambition would be enough. Now ships drifted damaged, waiting for help that could not move fast enough. And the question no one wanted to ask pressed closer with every passing hour. When the Navy chose to build these giants, did it already know the cost and decide to pay it anyway? The break came not in theory but in motion, when damaged ships limped back from the edge of combat expecting relief and instead found delay, confusion, and still water where action was promised, because the floating repair base that was meant to meet them forward was already overwhelmed before the first hull arrived. Word traveled faster than steel. A destroyer reported propulsion damage. Another ship followed with torn plating and exhausted crew. They were told help was close, close enough to matter, close enough to turn retreat into return. But as the ships approached, the scale of the failure revealed itself piece by piece. The floating yard was there, massive and imposing, but it was not ready. Cranes stood idle while decisions stalled. Space that looked endless suddenly felt cramped. Crews waited for clearance that never came quickly enough. Time stretched. The sea did not. Enemy pressure remained constant, and every hour out of action felt like surrender without permission. Officers aboard the damaged ships expected immediate triage, fast patchwork, a rapid push back into the fight. Instead, they were met with bottlenecks, arguments over priority, and the realization that the system designed to absorb chaos could not even absorb demand. One ship was told to wait offshore. Another was ordered to move aside for something worse. The yard itself became a traffic jam made of steel and expectation. Nothing catastrophic happened all at once, and that was the most dangerous part. There was no explosion to point to, no single order to blame. Just a growing understanding that the forward repair lifeline was slower than the damage it was meant to heal. Crews stayed aboard crippled vessels longer than planned, watching the horizon instead of returning to it. Officers recalculated missions that had already been approved hours earlier. Escorts were reassigned. Schedules collapsed quietly. The failure multiplied outward, turning one damaged ship into two delayed missions, then into a gap that could not be explained without admitting what had gone wrong. The floating yard was not destroyed, not attacked, not sabotaged. It simply could not keep up. The ocean swayed it gently as men argued over what could be fixed now and what would have to wait, and waiting became the enemy's greatest ally. One captain realized too late that staying close to the repair base made his ship safer from sinking but more dangerous to the fleet, because it removed a weapon from the fight at the exact moment it was needed most. Another commander pushed his crew to attempt temporary fixes at sea, not because it was safer, but because it was faster than trusting the system meant to protect them. The yard's presence was supposed to shorten wars, not stretch them thin, yet here it stood, a symbol of confidence that cannot translate into action under pressure. Messages went out requesting guidance. Answers came back cautious, measured, delayed. No one wanted to say the obvious. The forward repair solution was failing in real time, and every decision now carried the weight of that truth. Ships that should have been repaired and returned were instead forced into limbo, neither fully withdrawn nor ready to fight. The incident did not end with a dramatic order or a clear outcome. It ended with something worse. Acceptance. Acceptance that this moment would pass without correction, that the mission would move forward minus the ships that had depended on the floating yard, that the gap created here would be explained later in softer language. When the damaged vessels finally pulled away, some toward distant ports, others back into action still wounded, the floating shipyard remained behind, enormous and intact, yet exposed in a different way. It had failed not because it was attacked, but because it was trusted, and in that moment, the Navy crossed an invisible line. This was no longer a trial or an anomaly. This was the instant the idea broke under reality, when the fleet learned that its safety net could stretch, but not hold, and the cost of that discovery would not be measured in reports, but in what did not return to the fight. What made that moment so unsettling was not confusion, but contrast, because these floating shipyards were never imagined as fragile solutions or temporary experiments. They were sold as certainty made of steel, as proof that distance no longer mattered and that damage no longer dictated retreat. The expectation was clear long before the first hull ever tied up alongside them. Ships would fight forward, take punishment, fall back briefly, and return almost immediately, patched, reinforced, and ready, without crossing oceans or abandoning pressure. These platforms were meant to erase geography, to turn the vastness of the Pacific into something manageable, predictable, controlled. They were described not as support, but as force multipliers, able to compress time itself by keeping warships where they mattered most. Commanders were encouraged to plan aggressively because help would always be nearby. Damage was no longer supposed to mean absence. It was supposed to mean delay, measured in hours, not weeks. That belief shaped decisions far from the repair decks themselves. Missions were approved with tighter margins. Risks were accepted because recovery was assumed. Ships stayed forward longer because they were told they could be made whole again without leaving the theater. The floating yards were framed as self-contained answers, carrying tools, labor, and capability wherever the fleet advanced. They were massive on purpose, built to signal permanence, reliability, and inevitability. Nothing about them suggested hesitation. And yet the reality unfolding alongside them felt nothing like the promise. The same size that inspired confidence now created friction. The same complexity that was meant to solve problems created new ones. Instead of rapid turnaround, there was sequencing. Instead of flexibility, there was prioritization. Instead of speed, there was waiting. The contrast was not subtle. Ships that should have rotated in and out with efficiency instead stacked up, each one consuming space, attention, and time that could not be duplicated. The expectation had been that these yards would function like extensions of shore facilities, only closer, faster, and immune to the limitations of distance. What emerged instead was something caught between worlds, too large to move easily, too centralized to adapt quickly, and too critical to ignore once it slowed. Officers who had been told to trust the system now had to work around it, adjusting operations not because the enemy had changed, but because the support behind them could not meet its own promise. The floating yards were not supposed to dictate tempo. They were supposed to enable it. Yet here they were, silently reshaping the rhythm of war simply by being unable to deliver on what had been assumed. The expectation had never been perfection. Damage was expected. Delays were understood. But failure at this scale was not. These platforms were meant to absorb pressure, not become another pressure point. The Navy did not imagine captains choosing between waiting for repair or risking further damage at sea. It did not imagine crews questioning whether proximity to help was actually slowing their return. It did not imagine commanders factoring the limitations of the yard into battle planning, because the yard itself was supposed to remove limitations. The contrast cut deeper because nothing about the original vision suggested fragility. The language used around these floating shipyards was confident, almost defiant, framing them as answers to a kind of warfare that demanded constant presence. And yet the incident had shown that presence alone was not enough. A structure could exist exactly where it was promised to be and still fail to deliver what it represented. The ships drifting nearby were proof that expectation does not bend easily into reality, especially when reality demands speed, clarity, and adaptation all at once. This was not a story of broken steel or missing equipment. It was the collapse of an assumption, a quiet realization that a system designed to eliminate withdrawal was now forcing it in slower, less visible ways. The Navy had expected these floating shipyards to shorten the distance between damage and return. What it encountered instead was a widening gap between belief and function, a gap measured not in miles, but in lost momentum. And once that contrast became visible, it could not be unseen, because every ship that waited made the promise feel thinner, and every mission adjusted around that waiting made the failure harder to dismiss as coincidence. What unsettled commanders most was how familiar the failure began to feel, because once attention shifted away from that first incident, the same pattern surfaced again with uncomfortable clarity. Another damaged ship arrived expecting speed and found sequence. Another crew was told to hold position while priorities were reassessed. Another mission was quietly altered because a vessel that should have returned in days was still tied alongside steel that could not move faster. Each case looked manageable on its own, almost reasonable when isolated, but together they formed a rhythm that was impossible to ignore. The floating yards did not collapse. They persisted, and that persistence became the problem. Ships rotated through them slower than planned. Repairs overlapped instead of flowing, and every new arrival added weight to a system already stretched thin. The repetition stripped away the comfort of exception. This was not weather, not enemy interference, not bad luck. It was the same sequence repeating under different names and different hull numbers. Crews began to arrive already expecting delay, adjusting their posture before the first order was given. Officers learned to ask not when repairs would begin, but how many ships were already waiting. Operational plans quietly absorbed this reality, with allowances built in for time that had never been supposed to exist. The pattern did not announce itself dramatically. It revealed itself through accumulation. One ship delayed became two. Two became a backlog. A backlog became an accepted condition. The floating yards, meant to keep pressure forward, now carried their own gravitational pull, drawing damaged ships into prolonged orbit. Each additional incident reinforced the same uncomfortable truth. The system behaved the same way under stress every time. It slowed. It centralized. It forced choice instead of providing relief. And because nothing visibly broke, nothing was immediately fixed. Reports described congestion. Messages mentioned strain. Language softened what repetition made clear. The failures shared a shape, even when their details differed. Ships waited. Crews adapted. Missions shifted. The enemy did not need to exploit the weakness directly because it already existed within the rhythm of operations. Over time, the pattern became self-sustaining. The more ships relied on the floating yards, the more pressure those yards absorbed, and the more delay they created. What had been designed as a solution to repeated withdrawal was now quietly creating its own version of it, not through retreat, but through waiting. And with each repetition, the idea that this was temporary became harder to defend, because temporary problems do not behave the same way every time. Patterns do. By the time the pattern became visible on the water, it had already existed on paper, in cautious language and controlled doubts that never reached the surface where they could force change. Long before crews felt the delays, questions had been raised quietly, framed not as accusations but as concerns, the kind that asked whether capacity would match demand, whether movement would stay flexible once pressure arrived, whether scale alone guaranteed speed. Early tests produced mixed confidence. Internal notes flagged limitations that were easy to tolerate in isolation and easy to dismiss in optimism. No one wrote that the concept would fail. They wrote that it might strain. They suggested adjustments. They recommended patience. Those warnings did not stop the project. They were absorbed into it. As deployment neared, reports acknowledged growing complexity but treated it as manageable, something experience would smooth out once operations began. When early signals from the field hinted at congestion, they were interpreted as growing pains rather than indicators. Messages moved upward, softened as they went, stripped of urgency by layers of reassurance. The language mattered. Words like temporary, transitional, and expected replaced sharper terms that might have demanded attention. The floating yards were too important to question openly, too visible to reconsider quietly. Admitting doubt would have meant revisiting decisions already celebrated as solutions. So concerns were filed, deferred, and rephrased. When officers hesitated, they were reminded that the system had not yet reached full rhythm. When delays appeared, they were attributed to coordination, not capacity. The distinction allowed belief to survive longer than evidence. No single warning was dramatic enough to force reversal. Instead, there were many small ones, each insufficient on its own, collectively undeniable only after consequences accumulated. The Navy did not ignore every signal. It acknowledged them selectively, choosing interpretation over interruption. That choice did not require malice. It required confidence. Confidence that ambition would outrun friction. Confidence that scale would correct itself. Confidence that the cost of stopping was higher than the cost of proceeding. By the time the floating yards began shaping operations through delay rather than support, the warnings could no longer be framed as hypothetical. They had become lived experience. But by then, the structure was in place, the commitment made, and the momentum irreversible. The moment for prevention had passed quietly, not with denial, but with acceptance, and the system moved forward carrying doubts it had never resolved, only postponed. The cost of that postponement did not appear in summaries or briefings. It appeared in the spaces between missions, in the long hours crews spent waiting beside damaged hulls, listening to work that moved slower than their fear. Sailors slept aboard ships that should have been back at sea, feeling every vibration, every scrape of steel, wondering whether the delay protecting them now would expose someone else later. Commanders walked decks calculating risks that had nothing to do with the enemy and everything to do with time. A ship under repair was not just inactive. It was absent. It was a weapon removed from the fight, a presence commanders could no longer count on, a gap that had to be filled by someone else. That someone else sailed knowing they might not get relief when their turn came. Crews learned to live with uncertainty as part of their assignment. They watched repairs stretch longer than promised, improvisation replacing precision, urgency dulled by backlog. Some ships returned to action carrying the weight of incomplete fixes, their crews trusting judgment more than certainty because waiting longer meant surrendering momentum. Others were forced away entirely, sent back across vast distances not because the damage was catastrophic, but because the system meant to keep them forward could not absorb one more haul. The human strain was quiet but cumulative. Fatigue deepened. Confidence thinned. Men who expected the floating yards to feel like refuge instead felt exposed, knowing they were close to help that could not move fast enough to matter. Decisions made far from the deck now dictated how long they stayed vulnerable. Every delay translated into extended risk, longer patrols for other crews, tighter margins for escorts covering absent ships. Loss did not always arrive as sinking or fire. Sometimes it arrived as erosion. The erosion of readiness. The erosion of trust. The erosion of belief that the system behind them was as solid as the steel beneath their feet. Sailors did not debate doctrine or logistics. They measured failure in hours spent waiting and in orders that shifted without explanation. They carried the consequences forward, back into combat, into storms, into contested waters, knowing that the promise of rapid recovery was no longer guaranteed. The floating shipyards were built to protect lives by keeping ships repaired and present. Instead, they became part of a chain that quietly extended exposure, spreading risk across crews who had no say in the decisions that shaped their fate. The cost was not abstract. It was lived moment by moment by people who trusted the system until the system asked them to wait. The story does not end with correction or confession, because institutions rarely close the chapter on their own mistakes, especially when those mistakes are woven into success as well as failure. The floating shipyards remained, still massive, still essential, still defended as necessary even as their limitations became part of operational reality. The question shifted quietly from whether they worked as promised to whether the fleet could afford to admit that they did not. That question was never answered directly. Instead, it lingered beneath new plans, new deployments, and new assumptions layered on top of the old. The failure was not erased. It was absorbed. Lessons were implied rather than declared. Adjustments were made without acknowledgement of the cost already paid. The system moved forward carrying its compromises as if they were design features rather than consequences. And that is what makes the story uncomfortable. Not that a bold idea struggled under pressure, but that its struggle was normalized without reckoning. The floating shipyards did not disappear from doctrine or memory. They became precedent. If this could be accepted, what else could be? If the lake could be reframed as adaptation, where did responsibility settle? The Navy continued to fight, continued to innovate, continued to win, and that success blurred the edges of what had gone wrong. Yet the unresolved tension remained, because the same logic that protected this decision could protect others. The same confidence that delayed action here could delay it again. The unanswered question is not whether these massive platforms helped at times. They did. The question is what was lost in the spaces where they did not, and whether those losses were ever fully counted. If a system fails quietly enough, does it ever truly fail, or does it simply become part of the cost of doing business? And if that cost is paid by people waiting on steel that cannot move fast enough, how many similar decisions remain buried, justified by outcome rather than examined by intent? This story lingers because it refuses to close, because the failure was not a single moment but a habit of acceptance, and because once an institution learns it can survive unexamined mistakes, the next one becomes easier to hide.